Hello, I'm David Dean, Pastures Officer for Hunter Local Land Services. I'm here today on Tokau Dairy. I'm here with Peter Beale, who's the agronomist based in Taree. We're here to talk about East Coast lows. And Peter, what are the consequences of those East Coast lows?
Well, the major consequences is that they make up 20% of our annual rainfall. So if we're getting 1,000 millimetres of rainfall, they're 200 to 300 millimetres of that rainfall. And that's really significant in terms of moisture supply across the region. And it can be very significant in that it can take us from a very dry period to a very wet and good period and bring us out of drought very quickly, which I'll talk about in a minute.
Within the dairy industry, what are the consequences on pasture management with the East Coast lows?
Well, the biggest thing is, as I just mentioned, that they come about once or twice a year, usually once. It can be any month of the year, but particularly if they come in March, you can go from quite a hot, dry summer and the profile's dry to a completely full profile, wet. You've refilled the irrigation availability in the rivers, and that moisture in the soil can last 2 or 3 months. I did some work back in 2004. We had very dry conditions, but we had good rain, filled the profile in one significant event in April, or late March, and that rain lasted for about 3 or 4 months that those ryegrass plants were able to tap in and get that moisture. And that's important in terms of fertiliser, because if you've got moisture at depth and the plants are growing, you can still keep fertilising even though you haven't had rain. And when you know you've got a full profile after an East Coast low, then you've got the confidence, particularly going into winter, that I don't need a lot more rain to top things up and keep it going. And again, that can give you confidence to fertilise with nitrogen and get the pastures growing really well into winter. There are some negative things, and you have to look at losses that can occur during that East Coast low event. What can happen there is we go into a waterlogged period. We get a lot of denitrification losses, particularly on the poorly drained soils. And so you can actually lose the nitrogen that you put in the soil. And again, we had a very good example of this in 2017 in trial work, where we'd applied fertiliser just prior to the East Coast low, and we got quite significant responses to 30 and 60 kilograms of N. In the very next grazing or cut, we applied the same amount of fertiliser, but we had 300 millimetres of rain on the trial plots, and there was virtually no response. So that was a combination of the nitrogen we'd applied denitrified, plus the kaikiu that it was in was sitting in waterlogged conditions for 2 or 3 weeks, and we virtually got no response. And then after that, when we measured the soil nitrogen levels, there was no difference in whether we had fertilised or not fertilised. So we went into a winter situation after that where the nitrogen levels were quite low. So the corollary of all this is that you have to think about what fertiliser you're putting on before, what losses you might get, and particularly if you do get a lot of losses because of an East Coast low and a long period of waterlogging, then how much of a response am I going to have to make to recover? So in those situations, as soon as you can get back on, you've got to be fertilising and sometimes a bit more than normal to account for the losses that you've had. So there's some of the really important things.
Right.
The other thing that I haven't mentioned is that one of the good things about an East Coast low, particularly in November, is that we can come out of a dry period, very dry spring, and things look quite grim, but an East Coast low can fill that profile up and get kaikiu growing and really make a difference for that summer period. So that's really important in terms of not panicking in that spring period and just being aware that you may get right out of the dry situation at that time just because of an East Coast low.
Okay, Peter, so you're talking about the March one. So what about the winter and spring as far as pastures and fertiliser management with East Coast lows?
Well, for winter, it's a very similar story. It's just that things stay wetter for longer, but often your pastures are sown. It does have the same effect on fertilisers. And it can also set up the spring because you've got a full profile going into the winter, into that spring period. What's significant in spring is that we get dry soils in October, and things can look like it's folding up, and sometimes it's associated with drought out west. prices are going up for feed and fodder, and things can look pretty grim, but it's not uncommon to get a significant rainfall, whether it's a full East Coast flow or just a large rainfall event in November, and it can bring us from very dry into a really good spring rain, fill that profile up and set things up for the summer. I think it's really important that we understand that East Coast lows can be a foe, but they're also a really good friend at the end of a drought to change things. And be aware that that can happen at any time of year.
So thanks for that, Peter. Are there some publications available?
Yeah, look, we've got publications in a lot more detail, one on autumn-winter period, one on winter-spring. They're available on the LLS website, and you can certainly look into a lot more detail on what we've been saying.
Great. Okay, thanks very much, Peter.